Growing up, I never learnt how to use a microphone. That's sad, isn't it? It's all coming out now. Growing up, I thought of the night as a mixture of rest and adventure. Night was when I went to bed, but always aware that there were things going on elsewhere, out with and beyond me. From my childhood bedroom, I could hear mainline trains passing and cars on the bypass, my parents going to bed, people returning home late from the pub, engines and occasional siren blips from a nearby ambulance station, cats, foxes, owls, wind in the trees, rain on the roofs, seagulls in a car park where floodlights blazed, the electric milk floats whine around dawn, the steady increase in traffic on the road outside, the noise of neighbours, radios and televisions, the refrains of evening, night, and early morning. Sometimes, unable to sleep, I'd lie in the darkness, listening. I don't ever recall feeling frightened, at least not of the night. Worries would swell in the darkness, but that was mainly because of the vacuum of the small hours inviting overthinking. But often I could escape any angst by tuning in to the sounds outside. Aircraft on the approach to Bristol, the note of their engines changing as they banked and descended to line up with the Lulsgate runway. Real-world goings-on have always comforted me. News and stories of other people's lives make me feel less alone. To pay attention, be curious, engage in an open way, to take pleasure in small things, go for walks, to clear my head, make time to read and listen to music. Such mindfulness helps me feel connected and stay calm. To quote Henry David Thoreau, "Why should I feel lonely? Is not our planet in the Milky Way?"
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Manchester Poetry Library. As I speak, I conjure light. My name's Andrew Macmillan. I'm Professor of Contemporary Writing here at Manchester Metropolitan University. And it's a real joy for me to welcome you to this space. If you've not been here before, very quickly to say that Manchester Poetry Library is the only public lending library of poetry connected to a university. Anyone can sign up for free to become a member, take out any of these books from the shelves. And we're here tonight to think about the third in Professor Jean Spracklin's series, Night Vision. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second. But first, the very dull housekeeping. And so the toilets, for those of us that might need them, are just outside the door and just on the right. There are several toilets there. We're not expecting a fire, so if the fire alarm sounds, please save yourselves before you save others. Rush for the exit. Don't try and trample each other. I don't know. Just do what one would normally do in the event of an evacuation. Grab a bottle of wine and a muffin on the way out. We're here tonight because of Jean Sprackland, and with thanks to Jean Sprackland. Jean is a professor of creative writing here in the School of English at Manchester Metropolitan University, and you'll see from the screen behind us has curated this brilliant series, Night Vision, after the new non-fiction book, brilliant non-fiction book that Jean herself has published. We were lucky enough to do a launch for that book here last month, and it's for sale at the back of the room, and that book kind of dropped, I guess, almost into the kind of ocean of imagination, has had these ripples and these kind of movements outwards from it, I think, which involved Jean curating this series of events, of which this is the third and sadly final one. We've had Jacob Polly, we've had Andrew Michael Hurley, we've had Jean talking about her own book alongside Forward Prize-winning poet Karen Soley. And just in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Jean to introduce this event for us this evening. I think the quote that we've got on the screen seems incredibly apt, asking us to step over the threshold into the dark and to feel our way. It's why we begin these events always with darkness, with silence, and then into a reading as well. It's been phenomenal, I think, and very generous of Jean to kind of share the thinking and ideas that led into her own book and to curate this series of fantastic conversations with world-leading thinkers, writers and artists. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jean Strackland.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It is wonderful to be here again for the third of these events. We are small in number, but we have all the right people in the room, and a lot more people, I think, online as well. So, it's just marvellous to be here, and thank you so much for coming. It's been such a joy to have the chance to put on these events, and to find, as I thought about it and as I went along, that this topic of darkness is so multiple and draws in so much thinking from so many different sources. So it began with me thinking I would like to have poets and non-fiction writers on the programme. And then I discovered Helen's work and thought, oh yeah, photography as well. And then it also occurred to me to invite a novelist. And so it's been great to have these different practices feeding into thinking about darkness in all its forms and manifestations. And thank you for being part of that. So this evening, writing and photography come together to reveal what really goes on after dark. And I'm absolutely delighted to have two amazing guests with me this evening, Helen McGhie and Dan Richards. And the way this is going to work is that I'm going to introduce Helen and ask her to talk for a little while and share some of her work with you, bringing a visual dimension to the evening as well. And when Helen has finished sharing her work, then I'll introduce Dan, and he and I will have a bit of a conversation about his book, Overnight. And there'll be a chance for you to ask a question, which would be great to have. And then at the very end, as a kind of closing treat, we're going to see a short film that Helen has made connected with her Dark Skies work. So I'm going to introduce Helen first. And I'm going to start by just reading what we have in the programme, but then just ad-lib a little as well. Helen McGhie is a photographer, practice-based researcher, and senior lecturer at the School of Digital Arts, SODA, here at Manchester Met. Her creative research explores the still, moving, and sonic image to create new encounters with photography, often in non-art contexts, to engage diverse audiences in new, unexpected ways. She's worked extensively in Northumberland International Dark Sky Park in collaboration with the dark sky charity Kielder Observatory Astronomical Society. I kind of stumbled across Helen's work semi-accidentally at one time, months and months ago, when I was first thinking, I wonder who else there is in my institution who's thinking about darkness as much as I am, as obsessively as I am. And I found Helen's work very quickly and was so excited by it. I arranged to have a chat with her. And once we started talking, I could see all kinds of correspondences between her work and mine. I suppose the main one I would want to draw attention to is that it seems as if we're both really interested in the kind of unexpected aspects of darkness that don't always match up to people's first thoughts or impressions or kind of, general kind of understanding of what it is. And I remember Helen talking about there being a mismatch sometimes between people's expectations when they look at a dark sky and what they actually see when they look at that sky. I hope I'm not doing complete violence to what you said, Helen. But, that seemed really interesting to me and had a great resonance for my own work as well. I'm also additionally grateful to Helen because she's actually brought this visual dimension to the whole series. Every time we've met, we've had one of her images on the screen here, and it's been a reminder that, this is not all and entirely and exclusively about words, and there is this kind of, this whole other domain of thinking about darkness and that Helen's work particularly draws out some of the unexpected and surprising aspects of that. So I'm going to welcome Helen to come and talk about her work on darkness.
Thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm going to show a range of images on the screen. There we go, lovely. And talk through my photography, which is all about dark skies, being at night, being alone, sometimes being with others, and being with the forest as well, as you can see from this image. And this work is actually a result of a part-time practice-based PhD I did between, it feels like a long time ago I started it in 2017 to 2024 at the University of Sunderland, which I called Close Encounters, because there is a bit of a science fiction feel in some of my images. So the work creatively explores the dark sky experience in Northern England through photography, focusing on my encounters with darkness and experiences of communities, in contrast to the scientific visualizations that I was working with, because I was in partnership with Kielder Observatory. I worked in Kielder Forest, within England's largest human-made woodland and in some of the darkest skies in Europe. And actually, I realised today, because stats seem to change quite a lot with dark skies, that it's the third largest protected dark sky context in the world. So it's really interesting. So it's also, Kielder's also in a planted man-made forest, which has it's working. Quite a lot of kitchen surface tops are Kielder trees, interestingly. So you have quite a lot of Kielder in your houses, possibly. And it's also a recreational space as well, so including an art and architecture trail. And it's also built around Kielder Water, which is sorry, that suddenly flipped on for some reason. Why is it automatically playing? I don't know why. We'll see. So Kielder Observatory, anyway, so I worked in partnership with the dark sky charity Kielder Observatory. So it's got an organisational vision for everyone to experience moments of inspiration, wonder and hope through observing the cosmos. So seeking to support the observatory's vision to engage and build diverse communities within a remote dark sky park, I learned about the observatory's narratives and spent time in the park using creative photography to consider the dark sky experiences and engage with human and more than human communities within Kielder. So that included the staff, the observatory visitors, volunteers, and also the forest's wildlife, trees, ecologies, as many different communities who engage with the work as well. So these created key perspectives for contemplating the cosmos in the dark forest, where the senses heighten and the sounds of nature amplify. And you can see here it's quite an interesting building that actually looks a little bit like the deck of a ship, which connects with astronomical observation more generally as well, thinking about nautical, looking at the sky, being on a boat. Contemporary astrophotography contain the traces of scientific history, which are deeply subjective, and they showcase space as a place of otherworldly wonder through long exposures and what are deemed by scientists as false colours, which highlight invisible light to reveal wavelengths beyond what humans can see, and what the writer calls and critiques as, quote, deceptive imitations of the real. Through these two crab nebula images, you can see the differences in colour and crafting, not showcasing objective scientific visualizations, but mesmerizing visualizations for human consumption and public science communication outreach. So I'm really interested in how the same area of sky is actually visualized in two different versions. It talks about perception and how when we think about night skies and the cosmos through images, it's very much about how we see, how we experience that in our own minds. And in this sense, also creating mesmerizing images for science. However, for a science organisation and visitor attraction where paying guests go, there is a kind of a visitor economy where, you know, as we know in the world of industry, where we have reviews. And you can see here that such images present a practical problem for dark sky businesses when sometimes the images are telling this story of wonder, where you have people like the quotes here saying, quote, "I know you can't predict what you will see on the night. However, I do feel that the images on Kielder's website mislead the visitor as to what they might see. I just wanted to see beautiful stars and colours," which was a story that I kept hearing again and again about the reality of when people drive to this place, they don't experience what is seen. Kielder has a huge reservoir in the vicinity as well, which creates lots of fog. And sometimes, I think an astronomer told me that it was only 48% of the time you can see something in the sky, which might be the moon. So it's really interesting about this practical challenge. And I'm really interested in how I could use my pictures to create alternative visualizations of what space and the experience of being in darkness is. So my photographs disrupt astrophotography by engaging and responding to Kielder's communities, and I first created portraits. So through this, I learned different personal narratives on the dark sky experience from the observatory's human communities, as it were, explored the wild night whilst contemplating the dark forest alone. And by engaging diverse dark sky perspectives recalls Donna Haraway's calls for situated knowledges, which invites new perspectives of science and technology informed by and empowering grounded communities rather than enabling sort of top-down perspectives such as government space agencies. Again, I recall the pretty pictures. So I first created portraits, which I called wanderers, following how ancient Greek astronomers referred to planets as planetes, or wandering stars. And particularly as wandering is a large part of the Kielder experience for visitors who move around their position in the landscape like planets moving in outer space. And I started in the daylight. So you can see this is an image of night starting to fall. I started in the daylight to get my bearings, really, where there's an anticipation of night of waiting for the light to fall. But the stars, remember, are still there. They're just concealed by the sun. So through this process, I learnt about people's fascination for stargazing, their childhood memories, love of science fiction, and also their sort of stories about trauma, which led them to find a place with others under dark skies. So images are not just about making a picture. When you're working with somebody, you're learning about them. You're learning about the challenges of working in a space, potentially if they're working as an observatory member of staff, or you're learning about their stories. And so it's much more of an in-depth thing than just taking a photograph. So here is an image of Nazanin, the observatory science communicator and sustainability lead in 2020 on the path towards the observatory. The spotlit illumination enhances Kielder's darkness while capturing an act of observation. Staged, the flash captures an otherwise unseen moment of looking while referring to the observatory's place as a tourist attraction within Kielder's artificial human-made forest managed by Forestry England. This is a different science communicator, Jessie, as a potential abductee, seeing something beyond the image frame, which evokes the imaginative science fiction narrative shared to me by staff and volunteers. I learned a lot about astronomers liking Star Wars and other films. And you'll see here that I used again this flash to illuminate and it's a technique that I wanted to use to see subjects without completely disrupting the environment. So when you flash, it's momentary and then it stops and the darkness returns. You can also get a sense of the fogginess nature of Kielder as well. So reflecting on the work afterwards, it appears like a cinematic film still, evoking the role of looking up with dreams, fear of inspiration brought by the cosmos. Here, another astronomer, Natasha, slips into the night, and she described to me through this process, and I'm just going to read this to you because I think it's really pertinent. Quote, "We work in the middle of nowhere. We're so isolated and it's very still. If I weren't here, it would be just as quiet, just as still. The stars would still be there once you've lived, died, and generations have gone after you. In the forest, you're with the earth and with the universe. So for Natasha, astronomical practice is more than what is seen in astro images. It offers a poignant reflection on the human experience at a moment amongst the stars. But as a photographer, I'm curious. So, I walked beyond the paths that the forest park enabled me to encounter the dark sky experience deep in the dark forest. So I photographed the trees with flash to reveal them within the darkness, emphasising the human interruptions to Kielder's dark landscape when navigating with torches or car headlights. When photographing, the night gradually closed in and the repetition of trees disorientated me. It led me to lose my bearings and walk deeper into the night at one point. I had quite wet feet, I remember. And for five nights just before the pandemic, I slept, photographed and reflected on site at the observatory, so I stayed there, where it unexpectedly snowed and events were cancelled, and it was just me and the local wildlife, which was great actually, because it meant that I got to take lots of photographs of the observatory as it was, and to experience that real reflective feeling of being at night. I also begun to use red light because I was quite aware of how images and how light affects wildlife and ecologies. So red light is really important with this, because what it actually does is it doesn't disrupt nature in this moment. So this became a process of interest. And I used red light to evoke the safe light of the dark room, so the photography dark room. And also the safe light that astronomers use to see their immediate surroundings without disrupting the view of the cosmos. So it became quite a theatrical experience. But unfortunately, as someone using film quite a lot at the time, I realised that my handheld camera light meter was pretty ineffective, and I had to start beginning to guess film exposures. And I created and developed many what would be called failed images. I teach photography, and if students brought these to me, I'd be thinking, you need to adjust your exposure. But I was asking those questions of myself. But while attempting to understand the dark sky experience, I questioned the ethics of observation at night, of travelling to a dark sky zone and interrupting nature, or to capture a glimpse of the heavens for me, the observer. Should I be doing that? So my sight was compromised in the dark forest and other senses heightened. My imagination intensified, shifting from fascination to fear as I recalled the fairy tale narratives explored by writer Sarah Maitland, describing how, quote, "The forest is about concealment and appearances and not to be trusted. Things are not necessarily what they seem and can be dangerously deceptive. Trees hide the sunshine and life goes on under the trees. Forests are full of secrets and silences." So I contemplated how, when activated by the dark forest, the imagination challenges rational science. Considering this through the camera, I photographed Kielder's car park, capturing this image, dark adaptation, where red light creates an otherworldly, almost Martian scene. And you can see the odd tyre track, which again evokes a sense of a Martian rover. And this wasn't on purpose. This was just, I've got a couple of shots left on my camera. I'm going to take these pictures. But alongside photographing at night, I met with and learned from the enthusiastic volunteering communities at the observatory. And these are a couple of still life images from my series, Anatomy of a Northern Astronomer, visualising the tools required of stargazing. So, you need a star journal and you need a hot flask of tea, obviously. A lot of people said that to me. The work shows how the experience of stargazing extends beyond the dark sky park. And what this did is I actually showed it at Sunderland Museum and Winter Gardens as a taxonomy of experience as a dark sky observer. And this reached new audiences, and it was supported by the wonderful Northeast Photography Network. So this was a real way of bringing a remote kind of dark sky park to a city centre space, which I'm really interested in doing, because it's something that is quite challenging in terms of access if you don't have a vehicle. And that's a real vision within the observatory of what they're trying to do. I'm just going to play very momentarily a sound piece, and I'd like you to sort of close your eyes and listen to it, and then I'll tell you what it is afterwards. So thinking back to, should I be here, disrupting this environment with my camera, my vehicle to get here, and my light, I created a sonified image sound trail, which was actually it's images, it's photographs turned into sound. And I displayed this in basically the pathway from when visitors get to the observatory and they walked from the car park to the observatory. And this was to enable visitors to experience what you just have, which is a bit of an imaginative contemplation. And this was something that I wanted to do to enable people to experience photography in a way where it's something that is immersive and not involving extra disruptive light to see an image at night. So in a way, the images that I took and turned into sound evoked cosmic images, perhaps, in the mind. That's what I wanted to do. And people describe these as eerie, magical, scary, but making one visitor feel like an observer, which I really liked because it took me back to that idea of observation and navigation. And then something that I did as a kind of final exhibition for this was actually to show the work back in the forest and to think about how people can engage with the cosmos and dark skies during the summer, because it's a seasonal activity. So I like problem solving with my research. That's what I like to try and do. And so I created a project called Another Dimension and put these works back into the forest. And you can see here some, I want to say enthusiastic. They were. I brought them biscuits. And they were Forestry England workers who helped put the work up. And, I did say, I'm really sorry, that's a little bit off centre. And, but they sorted it for me. So they were really good. And I had 11 banners in total. And it was to enable people to gather a glimpse into the winter season during the summer. It enabled me to also put my work back into the car park. So you can see here the image actually photographed within the spot where I took that picture. And it was really interesting because it felt like portals and time travel, because we were looking at these images from the past, and after looking at them in this space at this point, the pandemic had happened, Storm Arwen had happened as well, which had really damaged quite a lot of the forest in Northumberland. So it enabled us to kind of look at the space in a slightly different way. And this is something we did with visitors as well. I like dialogue around my work, so I evoked that by bringing new arts audiences to the organisation and also enabling people to talk and look at the work. And then the one last thing I just wanted to very briefly show is something that came off the end of this research last year, was a project called Capturing the Cosmos, which I worked on with underrepresented observatory audiences. Participants from the West End Refugee Service in Newcastle and the King's Academy School in Middlesbrough actually worked with me, and they created their own experiences of night. And this was a way of collecting information that I then translated into more images. And so a lot of this was through dialogue. Again, I learned about the experiences that they had of looking at the night sky after work in a sort of urban setting, or feeling unsafe at night and wanting it, but feeling safe when they were with their partner. So I tried to sort of communicate those stories through my images, and the work is actually on permanent display in the observatory building as well, to bring those audiences back into the space. So just to conclude, really, by disrupting traditional ways of capturing space, my creative photographic research, particularly the final sort of sharing and dissemination, enabled multiple interactions within the dense and imaginative dark forest. It became possible to creatively explore dark sky experiences informed by the situated, grounded knowledges of Kielder's communities at the observatory and in the forest, whilst enabling new audiences to contemplate their place in the universe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that amazing insight into your work at Kielder. And I don't know about other people, but I'm completely fascinated by the idea of a sonified image. So I'm kind of longing, but maybe at some point, chatting afterwards, I'll be able to find out about that, and so will you. And also, I think the short film that you're going to see right at the end of the event has been through this process of being sonified. So we have that to look forward to at the end of the event. Thank you so much, Helen. So I'm now going to introduce our second guest, Dan Richards, who is the author of this book, amongst other books. He's the author of this book, Overnight, Journeys, Conversations and Stories After Dark, which is available at the back of the room to buy. And if you're very lucky, Dan will even put his very special bat stamp in it. Yes, he's brought his own stamp with him to stamp our books.
Yeah, so if nothing else, I mean, you know, you might not even want a book, but you might want a bat stamp. That can be arranged as well. Thank you for having me.
For a small fee.
For a small fee. It's very small.
So Dan Richards is a writer and broadcaster. His first book, Holloway, was a collaboration with Robert Macfarlane and Stanley Donwood in 2012. Since then, he's written 4 further books: The Beechwood Airship Interviews, Climbing Days, Outpost, and Overnight. His BBC Radio 4 series, Only After Dark, was broadcast to acclaim in 2022. Dan has written for the New York Times, The Observer, Economist, Esquire, and Monocle, and he lives in Edinburgh. And I think what I want to say about Overnight, first of all, is that it is just a glorious book. It's a celebratory book. It's a celebration of the night and everything and everyone awake and active in it. And there are just so many threads and so many stories in this book. It's marvellously multiple and vibrant. So if you take a quick look at the contents page, you kind of get a sense of that. I just jotted down a few of them. Night at the docks, night ferry, night on the streets, bakery, night mail, babies, bats, shipping forecast. He really kind of ranges over a huge kind of diverse canvas of experience to capture some of what is happening in the night. And Max Porter describes Dan as a wonderful storyteller. And I think that's kind of at the heart of it, actually, that, you know, you do have stories to tell and you are really great at telling them. And in the end, it feels as though what matters about the book most is this kind of instinct for the story and the instinct for the human connection that we experience through hearing and understanding these stories. I feel that Dan is endlessly curious about other people, and that curiosity and openness is infectious for the reader. So I'm just going to have a little chat with Dan now, because we've both written these books about darkness and night in the same year. There seems to be something...
It's fine, though, because we're not directly competitive. I mean, you know, I think it's fine. We can still be friends.
All right, we can still be friends.
Just about.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm relieved to hear that. I mean, actually, I think our books are very different from each other, but there is obviously a lot of overlapping subject matter, and maybe that's a good place to start. I think that some of the same things that motivated my book also motivated yours. One of those is illness. Maybe we'll come on to talk about that in a moment. But just to ask you, you know, what began the process of working towards this book for you? Where did your, I dare say, obsession with things nocturnal come from? And how did you come to think that could be a book?
I suppose, I mean, I always think about books as collections of things, and I think obsession is a good word, but it's also books often, writing a book, it creeps up on you. I don't know if this happens to you as well, where you suddenly realise that you're doing it almost without realising you're doing it. The book itself begins, you know, when you open the first couple of pages, the first story in the book, and it is a collection of stories, a collection of encounters, a collection of, I suppose, just experiences, both mine and other people's. But the first story is being benighted on the side of a mountain with my father, which happened in a previous book. It happened in my climbing book that was about published in 2016, so that I'd been mulling that over. The actual climbing had happened 2014-15, so clearly that wasn't something that I felt I was able to let go, this incident. And benighting and being benighted is a lovely word, which means overtaken by darkness, but it also means, I mean, in our case, it very much meant stuck. So, you know, and then we eventually got down from the mountain and discovered other words that we thought meant something, and local people who actually knew about climbing thought something else, such as bivouacking, which we thought meant sitting down safely and seeing the night out. But they were like, no, that's stuck. You know, bivouacking for them was a planned sitting down, probably in a comfortable way, maybe involving a cabin. So with that sort of thing, I suppose, you have things that are ticking away in the back of your head, the benighting, but then also I began thinking, I mean, that event meant that I was looking out and considering a little like what you were just saying with your photography, the world without you, and which is not a vacuum. There is so much going on, there are so many connections, there is so much life, and so you get this, you know, not necessarily a wanted image, not necessarily a wanted portrait, but still quite affecting, of everything going on without you. And you begin to think about your place in the world, in the universe, but also everybody who is busy while you are stationary, everybody who is active while you are often, you know, unconscious of their activity, and much of it interesting, benevolent, and worthy of having a light shone upon it. So being stuck on the side of the mountain was actually an opportunity. And, you know, my grandfather always used to say, the spectator sees more of the game. So sometimes, you know, to look, you have to be up, but still, which I am quite a lot in the book. I'm awake, but throughout the book, in a way, I'm trying to get myself out of the image, a little like you were doing as well, so you can see what's going on. And so I'm not always on the page, but I'm going out and discovering what other people are doing. And there was a history of night service in my family. My grandfather worked in the post office and on the travelling post office trains, and my mother was in the NHS for all of her working life. And my father as well had night stories. And as soon as you begin to think about that, you think, well, then I can begin to piece this together. And the other thing about being a non-fiction writer, because my books are notoriously difficult to put in a helpful place in a shop, because they do rove around, so they're just, you know, they're all right in the new non-fiction section for a while, but eventually they're not new, and then they have to put them somewhere, and sometimes they're in travel, and sometimes they're in biography and wherever. But because I've written some travel books, there's always this kind of, I hope, questing part of this. And when you're starting a book, there's also an opportunity potentially to get access to places you wouldn't otherwise have, but you've got that imaginary laminate badge that says writer writing a book. And, you know, it was helpful that I did the Radio 4 series as well, because also you're like, BBC Radio 4, and they're like, you know, at least they used to be. Yeah, absolutely, why not? So there's elements of that. And so some chapters in here I just wanted to do because they're clearly very cool. And others I thought because I've always wondered, and others I thought because it's not going to be fun at all, but actually that does make it of interest.
Yeah, and so there is a feeling in reading this book that you are just going out there and experiencing these things for yourself. And in doing that, you're also meeting people who are working at night, who are, you know, doing often incredible, you know, either dangerous or really essential things when everybody else is asleep. And this makes it a very sociable kind of book. You know, you allow those other voices in. It's not all you. There's a kind of feeling of generosity about it, and what we end up with is this kind of polyvocal piece of work in which your encounters and your stories of going out and doing these things are placed or woven together with other people's kind of chatting away about what it's like to work on the night train, or what it's like to travel by ferry at night. And so you've got this kind of engagement all the time with other people. And I think this is, you know, I was thinking what connects your work with Helen's, and this is one of the things I think that is actually quite it's counterintuitive to the point of being a bit subversive, because actually we talk about the dead of night. We think about night as a time when everything shuts down. We lie down and we kind of shut down. And the picture we get from your book is not that at all.
Well, actually, we're only able to do that because there are other people up and taking care of us in ways that we're perhaps unconscious of. You know, one of the chapters is spent 24 hours with a search and rescue helicopter team on Humberside, and they can have a 24-hour shift where nothing happens. You know, the same with, I mean, not quite the same, but similar for emergency services. You know, all sorts of emergency services, the mountain rescue teams and the ambulance and the fire and the police. You can have a quiet shift, or you can have a shift where you don't stop. And there's quite a bit of that in the book, because I suppose one of the aspects is the idea that we can only feel safe and comfortable to sleep because we don't have to mount a watch. When I was touring the book, I went to Ripon, and Ripon has a watchman still that goes back to the 8th century, and it has quite decent claim to be the longest uninterrupted human act that is still extant every single night since the 8th century. And they talk about the pandemic like that was a really difficult time. And I'm like, well, yeah, it was a difficult time. But also going back through the centuries to the 8th one, I'm sure there were also difficult times. But, you know, somebody blows a horn in Ripon Square and they say, you know, the watch is now mounted. And that means still, technically, that if anything happens to you overnight that is the fault of the watchman, they will pay you back for anything that goes missing and things like that. And these things still go on. But, you know, the modern equivalent of that is the emergency services and things like that. And the fact that, you know, just before we came on, the security chap came in and said, when are you all out? And, you know, 8, just to let you all know. So, you know, this idea of being looked after subtly, but it's there. When you begin to unpack that, that's a psychological awareness that we have. And depending on where you are in the world, it's either very prevalent or it's just in the background, a little bit of white noise there. But also, if you go and you talk to people while they're working, and this is something I've always done, I wrote a book, the Beechwood Airship Interviews book, was about creative practice, talking to people about how they work, where they work, why they work. They could be painters, they could be musicians, or they could be driving a bloody great crane at Southampton Docks at 3 o'clock in the morning. If you allow them to speak and you ask them simple childlike questions of how did you come to be doing this job? What do you think about why you're doing it job? What's involved with this job? Everybody is interesting, and they're far more interesting than they think, because they do what they do all the time. And again, it's that slight distance of being the genuinely interested, questioning spectator, I think, which I try and do. And I think that as writers, as creative people, we have this permission to be childlike, not childish, which is a mistake I often make, but you know, to be open and ask genuine questions. People respond to sincerity, I think. You know.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I would say about this book is that it's a very compassionate book, and it's a very hopeful book, and in writing it, you don't flinch away from the horrors of rough sleeping or nuclear submarines, but you talk to the people who are out there night after night, looking for people sleeping on the street and doing their best to help them. You talk to the people staffing those submarines. You know, the kind of human element is always there. And you seem to be, I'm sure this is true in your life, but it's certainly true in your book, someone who has a kind of homing instinct for that essential humanity and the good in people, even in absolutely dire situations. And again, I suppose, you know, one of the things that interests me about, I mean, I'd be interested in that anyway, but also as someone who's just been writing about the kind of negative stereotyping of darkness and, you know, trying to sort of just subvert that a little bit, or at least open up some chinks in that. You know, it feels as though this too is kind of warmly subversive in a really welcome way.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because Tom Stoppard has just died, and you know, people have been talking about him. And one of the directors he worked with said that sometimes they'd be reading scripts, and he'd point out that there was, you know, somebody had something in spades, or somebody, you know, it was chock full of something, or you know, he you know, had a, and he pointed out some cliches, and Tom Stoppard said, yes, but we need the cliches in there because they help people to ground themselves. And frankly, in a lot of Stoppard plays, you need the cliches because you've no bloody clue what's going on half the time, which is, you know, entirely what he meant you to feel. And I think it's that thing of, do we actually know what's going on here? When I go in and I ask, how is it? I don't think I'm going in, hopefully I'm not going in with a load of pre-existing, I mean, I probably am going in with a load of pre-existing prejudices, but I'm hopefully not going with a pre-existing set of outcomes that I just want to tick off, because I hate books like that, and they're often written by men, and they often go somewhere, and then the punchline is, and everyone agreed that I was correct, and very clever, and handsome, and funny. And I can only ever really be two of those at once, I think, based on my books. I just think that I'm going in and I'm trying to unpick what's actually going on. And sometimes that's not very nice, what's actually going on. Sometimes you're surprised, or sometimes it's just deeply sad. And it would not be, you know, I'm non-fiction. So you have to find a way of putting that on the page. You have to do justice to the people you speak to. And also you have to give your readers credit. There's a point in the book where I'm very unwell in hospital, and I have a conversation with somebody who's looking after me about the likelihood of my being intubated. And we have a conversation along the lines of who I'll see, who I know, if that doesn't go well. And the conversation is quite short, and it basically is, you won't see anyone again. You know, my partner was a couple of miles down the road, she wouldn't be let in. My parents were 400 miles away. So we had a chat about, so I'll die alone. And he said, well, you won't die alone, we'll be here, but you won't see your family again. Which wasn't very nice, but it was what happened. And you have to bear witness to that sort of thing. And it can work the other way around as well. You know, the chap up in the crane, we're having a conversation about his working life. And it's very interesting, people who work at night and people who are sleepless at night, or civilians not having a nice time at night is kind of here, and people who work at night is here. And actually, as a Venn diagram, there's not much crossover, because I spoke to Samantha Harvey, whose previous book, Orbital, was called The Shapeless Unease, about insomnia. And once, while she was not sleeping and at the end of her tether, she got up at about 3 o'clock in the morning and made a cup of tea, and then immediately went to sleep. And it was wonderful. And she went to sleep. And ever since then, when she's got up at 3 o'clock in the morning and made a cup of tea, it's had the exact opposite effect, but once it worked. And at Southampton Docks at 3 o'clock in the morning, I promise you, nobody is doing anything to see if it works. They are all so kind of, you know, it's dialed in, where they have, you know, and do we have a tried and tested method for this? Yes, because I'm operating a 200-ton crane, and the last thing you want me doing at 3 o'clock in the morning is trying some stuff just to see if it might work, you know, for japes. So the night as a quite controlled and lit and, I suppose, productive environment. And even in that hospital when I wasn't very well, the world was going on around me.
Yeah, I wanted to come to that actually, because this is quite a striking parallel between our two books, in that, you know, I've written about my experience of viral meningitis and photophobia and that sort of aversion to light and the longing for darkness that came with it. I wasn't nearly as ill as you were with COVID. I think maybe in the kind of second wave of COVID, which was really nasty, and still before vaccination was kind of available to most of us. One of the things that really kind of I found not only interesting but really moving about that part of the book is that you describe that experience of being in hospital as being crepuscular and twilight, and of the sense that you had, I think this is probably when you're in intensive care, of dark and light kind of blurring, or night and day sort of blurring into one, and the unravelling of your sense of time as a result of that. I wondered, actually, maybe you wouldn't mind reading a little bit of that. There's a bit on page 36. Yeah. Oh, 30. Well, yeah. Where you're writing particularly about the darkness. The next day passed. That bit.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. So I'm in hospital at this point. The next day passed. The blinds were drawn, or they weren't, and I didn't register the daylight. The room was dark, certainly, or it wasn't, and my memories are dim. I must have eaten, but I don't recall a meal. I know that I had injections of anticoagulant into my stomach. They tested my blood oxygen levels, my blood pressure, and pricked blood from my fingertips to test for glucose every few hours. I was started on a course of steroids for my lungs. At some point I noticed that I was still dressed, still had on my home clothes under the covers. How odd, I remember thinking, looking past the blur of my oxygen mask at my jeans, but doing nothing about it. For some reason, that set me off crying again. Thanks for this, Jean, this is great. Towards evening, or late into night, a critical care doctor came to see me. He drew the curtains around my bed, even though we were alone, and asked me how I felt. I said I felt okay, but understood that I wasn't well. No, he said, you're a bad case. He was concerned that I wasn't responding to treatment. My oxygen level was still very low. How would I feel about being intubated? I tried to sit up, focus all my energy, tried to be as calm as I could.
Thank you. Sorry,
That's all right.
probably.
I think I tried to be as calm and clear as I could. I told him that I found the prospect of intubation worrying.
Yes, a sort of devastating understatement there, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there are two things. I mean, it's a very moving part of the book, but I guess there are two things that I particularly wanted to kind of draw out of that. One is this half light that you're existing in, this low light that you're existing in during that time, and I'm wondering what that kind of, how that's affected your feelings maybe about darkness or that kind of, those kind of twilight, low-lit conditions, if it has. And the other is in relation to something you were saying about people taking care of us, and that whole huge world of medical professionals working through the night, which we only become aware of when we need to be aware of it, unless we happen to have someone in our family, as you did. Your mother worked in the night as a nurse, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Actually, and then later nurse practitioner, and got her, she was on the first wave. I think she got her degree from here. So that's good.
Oh, really?
You know, so you all have to buy a book
Fantastic.
now. But I think it's interesting. I mean, this idea of things being in plain sight, that idea of plain sight. I've just written an extra chapter for the paperback, which is out next year, where I engage with people who are partially sighted. Because this idea of plain sight, there's so many things about the night that I think are taken for granted by the sighted, by the well slept, all of this stuff. And you only have to peel back, you know, a corner to see that there's a lot else going on under the surface of this. I think part of it that I'm interested in is this idea of service. Service is not, it doesn't feel like it's a very fashionable word, but I think it used to be easier potentially to be in service of an idea. And certainly when my grandfather was working in the post office, he was incredibly proud of that, you know, and that was a job for life. When he retired in his early 60s, he did get a carriage clock, and he also got a whacking great pension. But then the more that I learned about his service, the more I realized that there was an element of benevolence and, you know, real hard work that went into an institution that actually looked after people and also delivered in so many ways. My mother, the same. You know, she was in the NHS for all those years. And I think in the pandemic, it became clear that you only really stop and notice certain things when they stop, you know, when the people who put all the loo roll on the lorries, if they're not on the job, then you're not on the job. And it's so much of it was this interconnectedness and these webs, because when I was at Southampton Docks, it was shortly after in fact, it might even been during the time when the Ever Given was stuck in the Suez Canal, which was, you know, like the world economy choked because you had something blocking a main artery there, to mix a metaphor horribly. So you only really think about these systems and these, not only systems, but reliances, you know, because we all like to think that we're independent people. We all like to think that, you know, we're choosing. But so many of the systems that we're engaged with and enmeshed with night and day are beyond and out with us. And we're reliant on those. And it's not very comfortable. You know, when you go in and you are in the NHS, you're actually in the, you know, at the sharp end of the NHS. Yes, it works. But I described my certainly early days in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary as a time of great care, but no comfort, because there isn't bloody time.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, if you're going in and you're as ill as some people were, they have to get lines in. They have to, you know, I'm sorry it hurts, but you will be alive afterwards. In the same way, there's a chapter in the book about babies, and I'm having my first child hopefully in January, which is very exciting. Again, you have to buy a book now you know that. And I'll be joining the ranks of the, you know, crazed and delighted and, you know, people that I spoke to. But I was at an antenatal class recently, and the first three were all fun and games, and then the fourth one, the room resounded to people smacking the backs of pretend baby dolls and doing CPR on baby dolls and things like that, and the strange soundtrack of all of these young enthusiastic parents basically sort of like, you know, basically kicking the shit out of some children for their own good. And it was really, really shocking, but at the same time it was quite comical juxtaposition of all of these people who are there. This is how you care. And hospital is obviously like that as well, when people worry about, am I going to break ribs with CPR? Yes, but the person might be alive. They probably thank you for that. Do you know what I mean?
Right, absolutely. And, you know, it's interesting, that thing of your mother working in the NHS, and then you've mentioned your grandfather working on the travelling post office. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about him. Was it Bob?
It's Bob, yeah. I've got a reading about Bob. The other thing about this is that there are different registers. So I think a book is an opportunity to kind of really, you're given carte blanche to some degree, although, you know, B in your case might have an opinion, and I think my editor at the time certainly had opinions, so you have to stick within the white lines. But each chapter in the book has a different register to some degree. Some of them I'm involved, some of them I'm not. The night mail trains have such a place in the public psyche, I think, ever since 1936, with the GPO film, with a verse commentary by Auden and Benjamin Britten's soundtrack. And my grandfather worked on the trains. So I'll read you a little bit, and then I'll raise my hand in the air, but don't worry about that. It's not for you. Listening back now to the recordings I made of Bob, recalling his days on the trains, I realise I left it too late. He was in his 90s and tired, slightly confused and vague. I hear myself on the tape asking leading questions, willing him to remember. But he can't remember, not clearly, and tends to circle back to old stories and firm ground. The Bristol Plymouth TPO, travelling post office, departed Temple Meads at 9 a.m. The return trip left Plymouth at 5. Home late. A long old day. I can hear the wonder in his voice, halcyon days long ago. I look back at the notes I have about Bob's life, the things I wrote about him in a previous book. Although he'd long retired by the time I was born, he used to tell me stories of his days on the railways. After the run down to Devon, he and his crew would often go for a swim at the YMCA or the Plymouth Ho Lido beneath Smeaton's Tower. Bob was an inexhaustible source of tall tales about the tower, about his exploits as a motorcycle messenger during the Second World War, his subsequent army experiences in Egypt, India, a year at sea, then latterly his life on the TPO. He seemed to have lived a boy's own dream. A favourite tale he particularly enjoyed telling was about the time his train smashed through a set of oak crossing gates on the Wellington Bank in Somerset and blew them to Matchwood Dan. Nothing left. We were going like the clappers 100 miles an hour down over the bank, then bang! And the steam locomotive, not a scratch. Which is all fun and games, but reading it now, writing this book, I can see the things hiding in plain sight. There I go. And it dawns on me how hard he must have worked, racing to sort mail by set times and locations so that it could be wrapped up and dropped at speed. Pouched mails off, pouched mails on, the bang and whip of the spring-loaded net, scooping leather bags in passing and bouncing them into the carriage. Machinery in action, things to go wrong. The cold and wind of the open hatch when the nets were out, the scudding dark of the night beyond, smoke and steam from the engine acrid in the air, the bellow of the loco, the movement of the coach, swaying as you sorted, knowing where you were by the feel of the track, the sounds on the journey, a kind of full-body geographical braille, a permanent wayfinding. The whoosh-whoosh of two bridges close together, the flume of a station, the clatter of points, the subtle G-forces of a long sweeping curve, descents, inclines, the howl of a tunnel, the sound of the western working hard, vibrations through the long concertina of the train, whistles, the tightening of the brakes, level crossing bells, the somersault jolt of a junction, the smell of the Bridgewater cellophane works, sorting the letters under trembling lights, handfuls of envelopes, copperplate and scrawl, best guess addresses, stamps, francs, pen, pencil, an almost automatic set of movements to file them, envelopes shot into pigeonholes chalked with postcodes, towns, cities, sacks on hooks, bundled letters in the sacks. Every time a niche gets full, you take the post, you tie it, and you put it in the apposite sack. Someone making up the next pouch for deposit, bags wrapped in leather, spring clips and knots, one coach, several counties, the song of the rails, dry hands, sore feet, the loop of line to Weston-super-Mare, then back on the main drag to Bridgewater, Taunton, Tiverton Junction, Exeter St David's, Newton Abbot, Totnes, Plymouth, and back. The beat of the loco, the rhythm of the track. Mails off, mails on, hatch open, bag set, mail out, mail in, and on. The B&P TPO departed Temple Meads at 9 a.m. The return trip left Plymouth at 5. A long old day. I hear the wonder of his voice, halcyon, vital, and long ago.
Wow, thank you so much, Dan. I think, apart from the fact we've all just been run over by a train, that's marvellous. I wonder if anybody, we've got time probably for a couple of questions, if there's anybody who would like to ask a question, either of Dan or of Helen. We do, I think, have a mic, or if not, you can use this one.
While you're thinking, that train that we just heard was actually one of Bob's trains. I've been chasing it around the country for a while and finally got it to go past me quite quick, which just involves getting ahead of it, but not like that. Not, you don't want to cause a nuisance on the railways. But yeah, any questions would be great. There's a question.
Hello. Thank you very much for your readings and for your presentation as well, Helen. I was just wondering if anyone had tried to encourage you to fictionalize your collection of stories.
Not really. No one's encouraged me to fictionalize them. I think quite a lot. I mean, I'm always fascinated by how unlikely and poetic and affecting just, if I often think left the transcriptions of the conversations I had, if I left them alone and just presented them without much of a frame around them. I mean, sometimes I have done that in the book, but even in a raw state, they always strike me as so sort of wonderfully, I suppose poetic. Did you find this with yours? That the conversation, with yours, there are certain stories that just sing almost in a raw state, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was aware of kind of pushing at the boundaries of fiction sometimes in my book, maybe more than you have done in yours. I don't know.
There's something I call, so I'm friends with a writer called Cal Flynn, who uses what I call the kind of New Yorker rules. And the New Yorker rules are if you say that someone drank a drink in a bar, then the New Yorker fact checkers will phone that bar to ask if they were serving that drink on that day, So that's hard non-fiction. And I do this thing a little bit like that, a little bit just, imagining Bob. All of that is based on the research, like Bob's stories, the research of Bob. But it's not, he's no longer around, so he's not there to fact check that. So for me, that's a kind of like an I imagine based on all of this kind of, sort of hard non-fic research. There are some non-fiction writers who wouldn't do that, what's just happened. It would all have to be delivered either through someone else's memory and mouth or delivered in a different way. In a previous book, I imagined Jack Kerouac having a breakdown in a fire lookout cabin, based on his diaries and his novels around it and all of that things. But I think that sort of thing can lead to a kind of, that's hybridity. I think the hybridity can lead to potentially the reader feeling more of a connection. So I don't think, in a way, I suppose, I don't need the encouragement because I don't think I'm particularly pure in that. If it's effective and it's not untrue, I think it's fair game.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm aware of time. So if anybody does have a question they'd like to ask Helen or Dan, maybe we can mill around and do that afterwards. There is still drinks on the table at the back, I see. There are still books on the other table waiting to be bought. Andrew, do you want to come back and wind up for us before we have the final treat of Helen's film? But just from my point of view, before Andrew has his say, thank you so much to both Dan and Helen. Thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to the Poetry Library for running with this idea and hosting this series of events. It really has been such a joy for me, and I'm really sad that it's over now.
Sorry, Jean.
I know, but I'll recover later with a glass of wine.
Well, thank you very much to Jean for bringing us this brilliant series. As I say, across the breadth of it, we'd had this beautiful, moving conversation tonight between image, between space, between real-life encounters with the dark, with the night, with the body, and with illness. In previous events, I say, we've had Jake Polly, we've had Andrew Michael Hurley, we've had Karen Soule, we've had Jean talking about the book Night Vision. We're going to end, as Jean was just saying, with Helen's brilliant short film that we're going to watch, and that's going to be the kind of final thing that plays us out back towards the drinks, back towards the bookstall at the back, where we've got copies of Dan's book, of Jean's new book as well, so do get copies of those from the back and do hang around and continue those conversations. We've got many more events coming up at the Poetry Library, so do grab a programme from the back as well. The programme takes us forward into, I think, at least February or March next year, so do check out what's happening, as well as events that we're collaborating with Blackwell's, who are selling the books to us at the back, including Matthew Rice coming with his new Fitzcarraldo poetry collection in February. But yeah, just thank you all very much for coming. Please join me in thanking Helen, Jean and Dan, and look very much forward to now seeing the film, Helen. So over to you with a round of applause. Thank you very much, everybody.